Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of our listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, July 12th, 2025. Today, we're going to jump right into things with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined on the line by Hanna Diamond, professor of French history at Cardiff University in Wales, Great Britain, and author of the book Josephine Baker's Secret War, the African American Star Who Fought for France and Freedom. After that, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Gerald Early, Merrill Kling Professor of Modern Letters at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and author of the book Play Harder, The Triumph of Black Baseball in America. As usual, it'll be an enlightening morning, so be sure to stay tuned in. And while you do that, of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Reflection Eternal, Duke Ellington, Pharoah Sanders, Steve Snyder, Antonio Adolfo, and Rodney Jordan. Now, people, get ready for this train of coven taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Hanna Diamond.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night. What have you done with your life? Everybody time come to be embraced by the light. You're only scared to die when you ain't living right, man. And putting up a hella fight. Stay awake to the ways of the world.
Freedom Now.
To the ways of the world.
Freedom Now.
Yo, the time come for everybody. It ain't something you can really prepare for. Yo, Matt Duke, rock on, and Curtis Mayfield, rock on, and Grover Washington, rock on, and my Aunt Hazel, rock on, and Big L, rock on, and Freaky Ty, rock on, and Javoti Green, rock on, and Slang Time, rock on, and we celebrate life, we celebrate life.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Hanna Diamond, professor of French history at Cardiff University in Wales, Great Britain, and author of the book Josephine Baker's Secret War, the African-American star who fought for France and freedom. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Hanna Diamond.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today.
And thank you for joining us. So who was Josephine Baker, and why did you write a book about her?
Well, Josephine Baker, I think of her as being one of the world's first celebrities. We're very used to celebrities these days, but when Josephine Baker became well known in Paris between the wars, it was quite a new and innovative idea. She became this really incredibly famous dancer initially, and then she learned to sing. She became a music hall star and also a film star. Her first film was a silent film, and then she went on to make three speaking films, in fact. So she was this huge international star and had huge success in France, but perhaps but I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that, a little less recognition during this period anyway in the US, which was, of course, limited by segregation. And it was this freedom of action that made it possible for Josephine Baker to become so successful in France and across the rest of Europe.
And of course, she was born, if I'm not mistaken, in Jim Crow St. Louis, Missouri at the beginning of the 20th century and decided to move to France. Do you know why? Why did she decide to move to France, of all places?
Well, yes, she was born, she came from a very deprived and difficult background. She was brought up by her mother. They'd been deserted by her father, and she was put into service in white households at a very young age and was ill-treated. She would do cleaning and laundry and childcare, but she managed to better herself and come out of this very difficult, impoverished situation because of her love of dance. And she would dance everywhere, she would dance on the street, and she was picked up by Dixieland jazz troupes. And she married very young. She married first when she was 13, which was actually quite common in that part of America at that time. The marriage didn't last, but it enabled her to establish herself, if you like. And she went on to have some independence. And she ended up by performing in New York on Broadway, and was very recognizable. There are pictures that have survived of her at the end of a chorus line, pulling a silly face. She would go boss-eyed and be a bit of a comic on the end of the chorus line in these shows. And so it was that Caroline Dudley was prospecting to put together a troupe to take to Paris in 1925 for the Revue Negre. And this group, she wanted to put on shows in France, in Paris, because at that time there was a huge interest in African-American dancing, the Charleston, but also all things that the French associated with African art, African sculpture, African culture generally. So she saw Josephine Baker in this show, and she thought she would be an ideal person to bring to Paris and to show the way. She had a rather frenetic, particular way of dancing. Josephine Baker then came to France and was immediately delighted at the differences she remarked in the way she was treated. The story is she came off the liner from New York, and a porter came up to her and offered to help her with her luggage, and she was immediately amazed because in segregated America she would never have had this possibility of such help from a white porter. She put on her first show as part of the Revue Negre at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in 1925, and she danced what became known as the danse sauvage, the wild, savage dance in French. And indeed, she appeared on stage with very, very little clothes on. She was really mainly covered up by a few well-placed feathers. And she caused a rapturous, she had a rapturous reception, although some were terribly shocked by this very particular electric, frenetic way of dancing she had. And she became literally overnight the talk of the town, and she was on her way to being the huge star that she would become.
So approximately 85 years ago, World War II erupts. The Germans, the Nazis, occupy France, for example, and that turns her world upside down. She becomes a kind of espionage agent, particularly in Casablanca, Morocco, where she was confined for 18 months. Could you describe her experience in that regard?
Yes, well, Josephine Baker, by the time of the outbreak of the war, had become an absolutely huge star, as I said earlier. And she really felt that she had a debt of gratitude that she wanted to pay back to the French. And she wanted to join the war effort, and she also understood Nazism. She'd toured in Germany and Austria, and she'd been treated very badly by the Nazis. They called her a black devil, and they thought all jazz music was decadent. And in 1937, she'd married a Frenchman, a man called Jean Lyon. And at this marriage, she took French nationality. And this became something that she was very proud of. And she wanted really to enact this citizenship, this allegiance she had to France, and also to fight the Nazis. She knew also, because Jean Lyon was Jewish, she understood the dangers of anti-Semitism as well as their racism. And so Josephine Baker, when she was approached by a man called Jacques Abté, who was head of the French counterintelligence services in Paris, she said, yes, I would like to help the Allied war effort. I would like to help counterintelligence and help the secret services. And although Jacques Abté didn't think that Josephine Baker was an obvious choice for a spy, you know, when we think of spies, we think of someone who's going to melt in to the crowds and not be noticed. And here was this great star who was followed by the public and journalists wherever she went. He found that she could be very useful to him because Josephine Baker had connections. She would be invited to receptions. She had access to people who were in the know, and she could report back on what perhaps unassuming diplomats who said more than they should have said, or people at dinner parties, or officers who were in the know would reveal things. And she would scribble this information down and hide it on her person and report to Abté, who became, if you like, her handler, the person who sort of sent her on missions and asked her to do things for the French secret services. Now, after the fall of France, it became a bit dangerous for Josephine Baker and Jacques Abté to stay in the French mainland, although they did escape to the Dordogne, where Josephine Baker was renting a wonderful chateau. It's a wonderful chateau. If any of your listeners have the opportunity to visit, it's now a museum, and it's a very, very interesting one. But she couldn't stay in the chateau. They moved then, as you said, Gerald, to Morocco, where they started to work first for British intelligence, conducting, transmitting intelligence, collecting intelligence about what was going on. Morocco at this time is under the Vichy government, but the Germans are not actually present. But some of your listeners may be familiar with the wonderful film Casablanca, which represents really well this undercover wartime world of espionage, where there were German agents and Italian agents and all sorts of different French agents who supported the Vichy government, French agents who were working for de Gaulle. And there was Josephine Baker in the middle of all this, but also having valuable contacts with local Moroccan dignitaries who were also keen to meet and talk to Josephine Baker. And so it was, she would go on missions, she would collect information, she went to Lisbon, where she was able to meet with the British, and then later on, once the Americans had, after Operation Torch and the Allied landings in North Africa, she then was working with the Americans as well, all under the aegis of this work she was doing for the French Secret Services. Her main loyalties did stay very much, I think, with the French, although she wanted to help their Allied war effort. And she also talked very warmly about the American contribution to the war, and she wanted to help. She was very loyal to her native roots as well. But as you alluded to, Gerald, Josephine Baker fell very ill, and this interrupted a lot of her work. In July 1941, she became very, very dangerous and seriously ill. We're not entirely sure what was wrong with her, but she was very near death. On several occasions, she had to have operations, and Jacques Abté, by now, somewhat more than just a handler. I think they had become sentimentally linked, as you might say. They were in a romance. He would sleep in her clinic room and would worry terribly about her over this period. However, she did survive, and she had long periods of convalescence. And it was during this period that she was able, quite unexpectedly, to carry on with some of her espionage work by using her hospital bedroom as a cover for people to come and meet and exchange notes about the planning, in particular for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. What could be more natural than an American consul who was actually an undercover OSS agent, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the early CIA, if you like. They would come. We would like to come and see Josephine Baker. We know she's been very ill. We would like to meet with her and see how she is. And there they would meet in her clinic bedroom with members of the resistance who were helping the Americans to lay the path for their landings and their invasion and their capture of French Morocco and the rest of North Africa, as well as these very well-placed Moroccans who were very powerful and who also supported the Allied war effort. And so you see, Gerald, that Josephine Baker, although it was very surprising for a celebrity like her to be a spy, she was able to hide in plain sight. Nobody ever suspected her. She was able to travel around under cover of her celebrity, giving performances in Portugal, in Spain, and knew she had the visas. She was able to travel in ways other people couldn't, because here we are in the middle of the war, borders are closed. But no, they weren't closed to Josephine Baker. If she asked for the permissions, the visas to travel, she was able to get them. So she had this remarkable capacity to be in touch with the people who mattered, who could inform her, and she could travel around and get the information to the people who needed it.
So post-1945, after the end of the war, she returns to the land of her birth, and there's a very controversial incident that captures headlines that takes place at the Posh Stork Club in Manhattan. Talk to us about that.
Yes, well, Josephine Baker, she completed the war with a sense of having spent time with American servicemen, and when she did a lot of troop entertainment in the camps when the Americans were present in North Africa, and she became very conscious of the realities of segregation when she was doing these performances. Segregation, let's remember that she'd left behind in 1925 when she left America. She did go back for performances, but they weren't very successful, and she wasn't well received. And she noticed immediately the difference in treatments between the African American servicemen and the white servicemen. African American servicemen, of course, were not allowed on active duty and were relegated to the most unpleasant and difficult tasks. They had to bury the dead, work in the canteens, do the laundry, build the bridges. So when she was performing, she would talk to the press, and Josephine Baker liked nothing better than to talk to the press. And she started to extol the work of the African Americans she met. Excuse me. And she talked about wanting to promote the cause of her race. And she, I think, like many other African Americans at that time, believed that their contribution would lead to change in the post-war period. But of course it didn't, and after the Second World War, there was a lot of disappointment in these communities that things did not change, things did not evolve, and equality was not evident. And Josephine Baker went back to France and very quickly became involved in anti-racist groups and activities, and started to go back to America, where she would speak out about segregation and was very well received. She would talk about the inequalities that she experienced in America by comparison with what she experienced in France, where she could have a lot more freedom, and across the rest of Europe. And the people of the civil rights movement that was emerging at this point were so delighted with the work she was doing, that they even had a Josephine Baker Day where she was celebrated. I can't remember the exact date of it offhand, but I think it was around about, it was in 1951. I think it was in May 1951. And it was immediately subsequent to this Josephine Baker Day, when she was so celebrated for the amazing work she was doing, that she wanted to go to the Stork Club in New York to celebrate, and to with a number of friends. So she went to the Stork Club and ordered some food and some drinks with her friends, and found to her disgust that she wasn't being served. And on this occasion, she then left in a state of extreme distress and very critical. And she encountered at this time Walter Winchell, who was a radio commentator who had been very supportive of Josephine Baker's work and had spoken very favourably about her. But on this occasion, when she saw him in the club, she felt he hadn't been supportive of her, and he didn't speak out on her behalf. And thenceforth, these two, Josephine Baker and Walter Winchell, found themselves engaged. Walter Winchell would speak on the radio, and he really talked her down. He accused her of being a communist and of having joined the war effort only after the Americans had been engaged, and denigrating her contribution. And Josephine Baker had to set about really putting straight everything that she'd done. She actually came under investigation by the FBI as a suspected communist on the basis of Walter Winchell's public comments about her. Although they didn't turn up a great deal, it really did sour her relationship with the US for some while after that. And she started to focus more of her energies on trips to South America. And it was there that she met the Perrons, and was very influenced, in fact, by Eva Perron's work with the orphanages. And she was so inspired by this that when she went back to France and back to her wonderful chateau in Dordogne, she decided that she was going to adopt a number of children and bring them to the chateau and show the world that wherever you came from, whatever the colour of your skin, whatever religion you practiced, you could get on well together. And this was her experiment of the rainbow tribe that she tried unsuccessfully, as it turned out, to bring up in the chateau. But Josephine Baker's brand of anti-racist activism, it was a very personalised approach, did bring her a very strong amount of support from the civil rights movement, so much so that in 1963 she was invited to speak at the March on Washington. I think she was one of 2 women who spoke just before the great Martin Luther King speech. And there she was, standing on the steps in her French army uniform that she'd been wearing at the end of the war, sporting all her medals, talking about the freedom she'd experienced in France and urging people that this was the kind of freedom that African Americans should also have in America.
Finally, Hanna Diamond, author of the book Josephine Baker's Secret War, the African American star who fought for France and freedom. Josephine Baker is buried in the Pantheon in France, where heroes and heroines of note are buried. And on that occasion, President Macron of France said, and I quote, "France is Josephine," end quote. What did he mean by that?
Well, I think this is a very great honour, and it was really quite an extraordinary step for Josephine Baker's ashes to be symbolically transferred to the Pantheon, which is a mausoleum mainly full of men. And she was the first black woman performer to there are a few other women, really only a handful of women. So it was a really huge French national honour for her to be transferred there. And I think what Macron was trying to get across in the words you've cited is to say that the French Republic should be a place where that it is equal for everyone. Everyone can make a life, whatever the colour of their skin, whatever their beliefs, and that she adopted the French ideal of the Republic, the liberal democracy that is France, and she fought for it, and she lived it in her daily life. And he wanted to show that the French Republic is an open and diverse republic. I mean, it's an ideal. In reality, I think we may consider the situation on the ground to be a little bit more complex than that. But she certainly does, I would agree with Macron, she does offer a very powerful symbol of, and you know, she chose France over America. And that's a very strong message, isn't it?
It is indeed, Hanna Diamond, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me, Gerald.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Gerald Early, Merrill Kling Professor of Modern Letters at Washington University in St. Louis, and author of the book Play Harder: The Triumph of Black Baseball in America. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Gerald Early.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And so, why did you write this book, and what do you mean by the triumph of Black baseball?
The book was written as part of the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, their project of revamping their Black baseball exhibit, which I was a consultant for. I was one of 5 consultants who worked with the Baseball Hall of Fame revamping it. And that exhibit opened last May. They had a big celebration for it, a recreation of the East-West Negro League All-Star Game and all that. And a number of Black ex-players came to that event. So this book was meant to accompany the exhibit, and that's why the book came into existence. By the title, The Triumph of Black Baseball in America, it was important for me, and I think for the Hall of Fame as well, that we were going to present a story of Black people overcoming adversity and playing the game, and Black people through playing the game exerting a certain kind of agency in playing the game, and pressing certain kind of demands in playing the game. And also the development of the race itself through playing the game. So I think that's the reason why we all chose to use the word triumph.
And what role does Frederick Douglass play in your book?
Well, Douglass was a person when he was enslaved, and he wrote about being enslaved in his 1845 narrative. I mean, he wrote, other iterations of it, but the 1845 narrative, he particularly talked about sports playing or diversions on the plantation, and Black playing sports, and particularly ball games, stick games, ball and stick games, and things like this. And he disapproved of it as a kind of way that satisfied the master by having you waste your moments of being free. And that quote is used in the book to show Douglass's attitude at a particular time in his life. What's interesting about Douglass, and the reason why he's featured in the book, is not just simply because of that, but also because after the Civil War, his sons were major people in the development of Black baseball in Washington, D.C. His sons were involved with 2 different Black baseball teams in Washington, D.C. And I thought that was an important story for people to know. Also that as time went along, Douglass himself became a supporter of Black people playing sports. He certainly thought that playing baseball was not, his attitude about it was not the same as his attitude about Black people playing sports or engaging in those kind of diversions when they were enslaved. And I thought that was an important story for people to know, and that's why Douglass is featured in the book.
What role do Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois play in your story?
Garvey I mentioned because Garvey became a major figure in Black affairs in the United States and transnationally in the Black world. Around the time when Ruth Foster was pushing very hard to form the Negro Leagues. And Garvey was presenting to Black people with the creation of the Black Star Line and the idea that Black people could organize on a large scale and could create on a large scale business enterprises that would move the race forward. And I think he was a very important and inspirational figure in that regard about what Black people could do. And I think he was an important figure insofar as how Black people might be thinking about forming Negro leagues, because forming the leagues were something that was important insofar as Black people being able to organize themselves and being able to do something to move the race forward. So Garvey is an important figure in that regard. Du Bois was an important figure partly because he wrote about, in his book, The Philadelphia Negro, which I think came out in 1899, Du Bois wrote about Octavius Cato, who was a leading activist in Philadelphia after the Civil War. He was also murdered during an election in Philadelphia. And Du Bois was, talked about all of this. But what was interesting about what Du Bois did, or what he was saying, was that he did not acknowledge that Octavius Cato was a baseball player. Among other things that Octavius Cato was, he was also a baseball player. And his being a baseball player was very important to his identity and very important to his whole sense of mission as an activist. The baseball club that he started, the Pythians. So Du Bois gets mentioned because he acknowledges Cato in this way, and you see this kind of blending with baseball activity, with political activism among Black people. But I also thought it was interesting that Du Bois did not mention that he was, in fact, a baseball player, which I thought was important. I don't know if it was an indication that Du Bois was not much of a fan of sports, but maybe he wasn't. But it was an interesting. It was interesting how Du Bois noting about his activism, and I thought that was important because Du Bois was such an important intellectual and such an important activist himself.
What about the role of UCLA alumnus Jackie Robinson? What role does he play?
Robinson is an interesting figure. And of course, he's a figure everybody zeroes in on when people are talking about the integration of baseball. To me, the integration of Major League Baseball was important when it occurred and everything. But everything else with Black people playing baseball, to me, was just as important. And Robinson represented, integration, crossover culture, and that kind of thing. Robinson was also very much a race man. He was a very complicated man. And he was a Republican. He was a liberal Republican. He was very much for Black people having businesses and things like that. That's one of the things I wanted to emphasize in the book, was how much Black people valorize efforts of enterprise and efforts of business. Whether people want to interpret that in some way about Black people and capitalism, they can. I think that there's something else to it other than Black people, wanting to be capitalists. I think it's more that Black people felt that in some way developing businesses meant that you were strengthening and developing the race, and you were making the race, and you were giving the race agency by doing that. But Robinson was an important figure in the integration of baseball, and I think he wound up being. The thing is that the story, as I tell it in the book, does not emphasize that much Branch Rickey and Branch Rickey sort of being this white savior who got Robinson. I'm not trying to downplay Rickey's importance or anything, but there were lots of people who were involved with Robinson's integration of baseball. Paul Robeson. There were leftists who were involved in Robinson ultimately being able to do this. Black sports writers like Wendell Smith, who were pushing in Black newspapers and the like. So there were lots of people who were pushing this. The Tuskegee Airmen helped to make this possible. The Double V campaign during this World War II. All of this stuff helped to make a moment possible for Branch Rickey to do what he did. And in this regard, Robinson became this kind of representative man in that respect. But Robinson was a great athlete, and that was one of the reasons why he was chosen, because he's one of the greatest athletes in the history of UCLA athletics. And baseball wasn't even his best sport. But if it wasn't for the Negro Leagues and the 1 year he played with the Negro Leagues, it would have been hard for him to even have integrated baseball. So the Negro Leagues were very important in helping to integrate baseball.
Speaking of the Negro Leagues, who was Effa Manley?
Effa Manley was the wife of Abe Manley, and they both jointly owned the Brooklyn Eagles that became the Newark Eagles. The team moved. And Effa Manley was without question the most outspoken of all the Negro League owners. The Negro League owners, I mean, there are all sorts of studies about them, and the Negro League owners were a contentious lot. And that's not surprising. I mean, you're trying to operate, basically, in operating a league, you're trying to operate as a cartel, you're trying to operate as sort of a monopoly. And the problem was that the Negro Leagues were unable to operate as much as a cartel and a monopoly as Major League Baseball could, as white baseball could. And so Effa Manley was very outspoken about things, about how the league should be run. She was very outspoken about the league protecting its players, and she was particularly outspoken when integration occurred. And she thought that the Negro Leagues were not respected as a business, and that players were being plucked and nobody was even paying them any kind of money for taking players. The white major leagues weren't paying them any kind of money for taking players. Take, for example, a player that she lost, like Larry Doby. Bill Veeck ultimately wound up paying her. First, he paid her $5,000. I think he ultimately wound up paying her $15,000. I think he added another $10,000. Larry Doby was worth much more than $15,000. And so Major League Baseball players were just, Major League Baseball executives were underpaying and looking at this basically as what the Negro Leagues wound up being was this kind of a raw material resource. So it was a kind, I guess, one way people would interpret it would be a kind of colonialism that happened with taking these players. And she was very, very vehement in being opposed and speaking up for the Negro Leagues and for what they were and for the importance that they had for the Black community. She is the only woman in the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown.
Speaking of women, what about Toni Stone?
When Jackie Robinson broke into the Negro Leagues, into the major leagues, and started playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1940, there was a collapse in Negro League baseball because all Black people just, as a fan base, just went to the major leagues to follow Robinson, and then the players that came along after him. Doby and then Satchel Paige in 48 and Campanella and the other players came along. So the Negro Leagues lost their fan base. Now, all the Negro Leagues did not collapse. Negro National League did. But what the Negro Leagues that continued tried to find ways of attracting people to come to the games. Toni Stone was a Black woman who was devoted to baseball. She loved playing baseball, and she wanted to play with the best. So she spent a lot of her life playing with men. Negro League baseball that was continuing in the 1950s, one of the owners felt that, Toni Stone, we could have her out here playing and she could attract people to come to the games because of the novelty of seeing a woman play with men. And Toni Stone was very, very professional about what she was doing. She was very devoted to what she was doing, and gave herself, she really cared about performing very well. She, for instance, refused to wear a short skirt playing as the women and white women who played professional baseball did. She wanted to wear the same uniform as the men wore because she wanted to be taken seriously. She wasn't out there to be eye candy for the people who came to the game. She was frustrated because, of course, there was resentment, and she was never taken that seriously by the Black men that she played with. but she was a very courageous woman, and there was much to be said for her devotion to the game and what she did. And her story is included in the book because all of us thought, I thought, and the other people involved with the making of the book thought that her story was a very important one.
Now, did she wind up, in a sense, integrating the women's baseball leagues?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't hear it.
Did she wind up integrating or desegregating the women's baseball leagues?
That's an interesting question. She herself was unable to do that because at the time she wanted to play the white women's baseball league. I can't remember the name of it. The one that was celebrated in the movie A League of Their Own was segregated, and it would not accept black women, and it didn't take her. So she herself did not do that. And when they decided to integrate the white women's baseball, I'm not really sure about the date, but I can say that Toni Stone did not do it, or the other black women who played in the Negro leagues with men. There were a couple other black women who did it as well. They did not integrate at that time. They did not integrate white women's baseball.
Now, what about Curt Flood of your own St. Louis Cardinals? What role does he play?
Curt Flood is a very important story because Curt Flood was the opening. He wasn't by himself the opening, but he was one of the key openings to free agency. Curt Flood in 1969, after the 1969 season, was traded by the St. Louis Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies. There were other players involved, but basically the trade was Curt Flood was going to Philadelphia in exchange for Dick Allen, who at that time was called Richie Allen, who was the first superstar black player for the Phillies. He won the Rookie of the Year award in 1964. He was a tremendous player. And Flood refused to trade. He had been with, St. Louis for 10, 12 years. He was an all-star outfielder, great defensive outfielder, great player, great all-around player. And he refused to trade. I mean, he was shocked by the trade, hurt by the trade. Many players are. But he refused to trade. He said, I'm not a consignment of goods. I don't accept this trade. And so he challenged it in court. He challenged a reserve clause. The reserve clause meant that teams owned the player, and your contract was controlled by whatever team. And a team could transfer your contract however the team wanted to transfer your contract, which was how trades worked. And players really didn't have any say about what team they were going to go to or something like that, or whether they were going to be traded or whatever. And this was a reserve clause, and the reserve clause was justified on the basis that if we didn't do that, players would be jumping around all over the place, and there would be no stability in the game. And so that was the justification for the reserve clause. And so Flood challenged it. Now, he wasn't the first player to challenge it, but he was the most accomplished player to challenge it, and he was and he did it at a time when race, there was a lot with the black athlete. Muhammad Ali, this 69, Muhammad Ali was against the draft. There was the Mexico City Olympic Games in 68. The black salute at the games, and John Carlos and Tommy Smith and all that. And so, so it was this big moment, and he had, and then Curt Flood has sort of reinscribed the moment in a racial sort of way by making an analogy between this situation and slavery. And because people say, oh, you're being paid $90,000 a year at that time. At that time in '69, that was a terrific salary. I mean, it was more than most black people more than a lot of people were making. And he said, a well-paid slave is still a slave. And he said some words words close to that effect. And so he made that statement, and that kind of gave a racial charge to everything, and it was certainly seen in racial terms. What's interesting, though, is that the players union, which had just recently hired Marvin Miller to be the head of the union, supported Flood. They had a sit down with Flood, and they asked Flood, "Are you doing this because of a race thing? Or are you doing it because of the players?" And Flood said, "I'm doing this because of the players. It's not a race thing. I'm not doing it." So when he said that, they said, "Okay, fine, we'll support you." So they supported his suit. He did not win the suit. It went to the Supreme Court. He lost the suit. Arthur Goldberg, I believe, was his lawyer, who had been a former Supreme Court justice, and I don't think he really, critics have said that Goldberg didn't present the case very well. But in any case, he didn't win, and his career was basically over at that point. I mean, he tried to come back, but his body wasn't there, neither was his heart there to play anymore. But his story opened the door, and within a few years after this, limited free agency came to baseball, and it in fact transformed the world of sports when free agency came. So in this regard, Curt Flood is one of the most important players ever to play athletics in the United States.
So that opened the door for players to make millions and millions of dollars for playing a game. And if I'm not mistaken, Curt Flood wound up as a painter in Spain.
Yes, he did do that. He went abroad for a time, and he did do that. He was, he was a little bit of a bohemian sort of guy in a way, a little bit unusual, I suppose, in some respects for a baseball player. He was deeply affected by the 1960s and what happened in the 60s for the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power Movement, and all that. That deeply affected him and his views about things, which, led him to do this radical thing of challenging baseball the way he did.
Finally, Gerald Early, author of the book Play Harder, The Triumph of Black Baseball in America. What about baseball today? It's oftentimes suggested that baseball needs to beef up its public relations apparatus. I mean, for example, if you take the current star pitcher of the Cincinnati Reds, Hunter Green, from the Baseball Academy in Compton. His father was formerly a lead private investigator for the late lawyer Johnny Cochran. I dare say that many in Black LA hardly know about Hunter Green, not to mention about other superstar players or budding superstar players, such as the Afro-Latino Corps, led by Ellie De La Cruz of the Cincinnati Reds and O'Neill Cruz of the Pittsburgh Pirates. Does baseball have a public relations problem?
Well, we touch upon that in the book, and there is an issue about baseball and Black Americans. There are a couple of things that I should say. One is that to understand Black baseball, broadly speaking, you're talking about something that's transnational, because the Negro Leagues was a transnational thing. There were Black Latino players in the Negro Leagues because they couldn't play in the major leagues. When Jackie Robinson broke the color line for Major League Baseball, he opened up the door for Black Latino players. Felipe Alou, for instance, was a boy. He idolized Jackie Robinson, and was very aware that when Jackie Robinson, what Jackie Robinson did was making it possible for him, for people like Minnie Minoso, for him and other Black, Roberto Clemente and other Black people to play. So there's a transnational kind of aspect to all this. So Black American people reached their apogee, their highest point of participation in Major League Baseball in the 1980s. And now it's about 6% of the players in Major League Baseball are Black American, and well over 20% of the players, probably about 25%, are Latino players. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, why that happened, and among them was that Latino players for a long time were cheaper to get, and it was also easier for Major League Baseball players to, I don't want to use the word control them, but it was easier for them to deal with Latino players because, after all, they weren't Americans. And so they were visas. They were kind of like guest workers in a way. And in this regard, it was easier to deal with them in some respects than dealing with Black American players. Gary Sheffield, for instance, is a player who has suggested something like this. I don't know if it's quite that simplistic, but I do think that there are reasons for the big push with Latino players. The other thing is that Black Americans who are athletic had other outlets, professional outlets. With the growth of the NFL and with the growth of the NBA, there were other outlets for them where they can make millions of dollars if you were good enough to make it in those leagues. And people opted out for that. And also because the Black fan base tended to gravitate to those sports more than to baseball. On the whole, baseball is trying to make some efforts to reach out to Black Americans and to re-engage them with the game. And I do think they have a public relations problem. And I do think that Major League Baseball, professional baseball in the United States, needs to redouble its efforts to reach out to Black Americans and to re-engage them with the game. Also, I think that Black Americans need to learn more about how important the game was in the formation of our culture. I believe that Black people playing baseball, Black people organizing teams and having leagues was a very important cornerstone in Black American culture. And it's a story that Black people in the United States, Black people in the world should know.
And of course, they can learn more about this question by reading your book, Play Harder, Gerald Early. But I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Hanna Diamond from Cardiff University in Wales, Great Britain, and author of the book Josephine Baker's Secret War, the African-American star who fought for France and freedom. Next, we give thanks to Professor Gerald Early, representing Washington University in St. Louis, for sharing the context around his book, Play Harder, The Triumph of Black Baseball in America. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Baba Didan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can also email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And that's not all. You can go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org, scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.